back to reality here. So this is our fourth in the series of five Lenten series presentations. So it's Ann Morris tonight. We'll be talking about spirituality and the environment. So I've got a little biography on Ann here. So Ann was born in Montreal, grew up in an Anglican rectory on the South Shore community of Longueuil. Is that Longueuil? Okay. She graduated from McGill University in 1959 with a degree in music. Ann has been a long-time activist in education and advocacy for peace, social justice, and climate security. She served on a number of committees, including the Canadian Federation of University Women Peace and Security Committee, the Anglican Diocese of Calgary Peace and Justice Committee. Ann lived for 33 years in Lethbridge. We won't hold that against you for living in Alberta. Taught piano and voice, very talented pianist. She's also served as Executive Secretary of the Canadian Journal of Philosophy from 1982 to 2002, 20 years. When she met and married Ray, and they moved to Salmon. Ann's the mother of 2 sons and a daughter. So, welcome Ann. So, I've got a little prayer here to open with before Ann comes up. And this is by Chief Seattle. So, it's called The Web of Life. Teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. If men spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. This we know. The earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. This we know. All things are connected, like the blood that unites one family, all things are connected. Whatever befalls earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. We do not weave the web of life, we are merely a strand of it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. By Chief Seattle. Thank you. Just one more thing. After Ann's presentation here, we do have juice and cookies at the back, and so we can kind of meet and informally talk. Yeah. Just before you hear. Squeeze in.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be the presenter this evening. Spirituality and the environment. In the book of Genesis, we read how God created the earth and everything in it. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. The earth is a sacred gift from God, who created it so that everything was in balance and harmony. There were abundant resources to meet the needs of all people. No one had too little, and no one had too much. Everyone had just enough. The earth, as God made it, is the embodiment of God's economy of enough for all. But history shows that over a period of time, humankind's sinful nature gives rise to inequities in societies. Wealth and land become concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. A few have more than they need, while many others do not have enough. The ancient Hebrews recognized this, and they developed the concept of the Jubilee year, which was set forth in the book of Leviticus as one of the rules that the Israelites were to live by when they reached the Promised Land after escaping from Egypt. God instructed Moses that after every 49 years, the 50th year was to be declared a Jubilee year. Jubilee embodies two principles. One, everything in creation, especially land and wealth, ultimately belongs to God. And two, God's creation is abundant. There is enough for everyone's needs if the earth's resources are distributed equitably. Jubilee is a call for restoring right relations with God, right relations among the people of the earth, and right relations between humankind and creation. During Jubilee year, debts were to be canceled. Those who would become indentured servants or slaves were to be given their freedom. Land was to be returned to its original owners who had lost it because they had fallen into debt. And all of the land was to be given rest. That is, no crops were to be planted that year in order for the land to regain its fertility. But that wasn't all. The indentured servants or slaves who had been set free were to be given resources, that is, wealth, so that they could make a new beginning. Redistribution of wealth and renewal of the earth's fertility were seen as necessary in order to restore the sacred balance within creation and to reestablish God's economy of enough for all. The concept of enough is embodied in the Lord's Prayer when we say, "Give us this day our daily bread." We ask God for food only for today. This concept is also embodied in God's injunction against hoarding. When the Israelites were journeying from Egypt to the Promised Land, they were told to gather manna enough only for the day. And those who tried to hoard more than they could use in a day discovered on the following day that it was full of maggots and was inedible. In our time, God's creation is crying out for Jubilee as the gap between rich and poor widens and ecological destruction continues to worsen. In the decade after the end of the Cold War, there was some progress toward the restoration of God's economy of enough for all. Worldwide military spending was reduced, and more money became available for strengthening public programs and meeting human needs. In the year 2000, the governments of the 8 wealthiest nations in the world said they were going to do something about world poverty. In what was seen as a breakthrough, they agreed to a set of 8 targeted goals called the Millennium Development Goals, which were to be achieved by 2015, this year. 1 year later, on September the 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers in New York were attacked, the war in Afghanistan began, then the war in Iraq, and the global war on terror. World military spending spiraled. It now stands at $1.75 trillion US annually, which amounts to $4.6 billion a day. Annual spending on nuclear weapons alone is estimated at $105 billion US. That's 300 million a day. Yet, 790 million people in the world go to bed hungry every night, and 22,000 children die each day due to poverty. The international aid organization Oxfam reports that for the vast majority of people on the planet, economic inequality in their country is worse now than it was 30 years ago. Globally, we've entered an era of what's termed extreme inequality, with 1.1 billion people living on less than $2 a day. The impact is worst for the poorest among us, but it affects us all, really, because extreme inequality stifles economic development, it keeps some families poor for generations, and it exacerbates gender inequality, and it fuels crime and violent conflict. Extreme poverty is not only a deprivation of economic or material resources, but also a violation of human dignity and human rights. Without resources of wealth or land, the poor lack the means to fully enjoy and live out their God-given humanity, to achieve their full potential as human beings made in the image of God. Poverty is a form of violence and oppression. Climate change is making the situation worse because it is hitting those in the poorest parts of the world the hardest. A pattern of more frequent, more erratic, and more extreme weather events is already affecting millions. The result is more hunger and misery for the millions who live on the margins of global society. An estimated 150,000 people die each year from the effects of climate change, and it could get much worse. 10 years ago, the United Nations climate negotiators concluded that in order to avert runaway climate change, global warming must not exceed 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But the most recent assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates that with current policies, the world is on track for a temperature rise of 3 degrees to 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. A temperature rise of just 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels would result in a sea level rise of 3 to 6 feet. There would be drought over 40% of inhabited land, there would be hundreds of millions of refugees, and half of all known species would become extinct. A 4 degrees Celsius future would mean the end of civilization as we know it. Canada has one of the worst records on climate change. John Dillon, the Ecology Program Coordinator at Kairos, notes that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is calling on industrial countries like Canada to cut their carbon emissions 25 to 40% below 1990 levels in order to keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius. But on current trends, Canada is headed for emissions in 2020 that would be 150% to 167% higher than what would be consistent with a 2 degrees Celsius increase. Climate change is the central ethical challenge of our time. The life of entire ecosystems that humankind and other species depend on is threatened. Essentially, we are destroying the life-sustaining systems of the planet to enrich a small minority of humanity who can't hope to survive themselves if we continue on this path. One way of thinking of the challenge we face is in terms of biocide, geocide, or ecocide. The great earth scholar Thomas Berry said, quote, "We find ourselves ethically destitute just when for the first time we are faced with ultimacy, the irreversible closing down of Earth's functioning in its major life systems. Our ethical traditions know how to deal with suicide, homicide, and even genocide, but these traditions collapse entirely when confronted with biocide, the extinction of the vulnerable life systems of the Earth, and geocide, the devastation of the Earth itself." How did we get to the point where we are now facing the ultimate challenge? Respect for the Earth and its ecosystem is a principle common to all religions, yet much of our public policy reflects the idea that the Earth is an unlimited resource that we can continually exploit for material growth and profit. We tend to see ourselves as outside the web of nature, able to manipulate it to our own ends. Our Prime Minister tells us that Canada can't take strong action on climate change because it would hurt the economy. But the economy is an inseparable part of the Earth's biosphere. In fact, the word economy comes from the Greek word oikonomikos, which means the care of the household being our Earth. Now, the engine that's driving our world toward climate catastrophe is unfettered capitalism and neoliberal economic theory. Neoliberalism dictates that corporations should make profits unrestrained by government intervention. It portrays the market as an invisible hand that governs all human and economic activity with a logic that can't be interfered with. Effectively, neoliberalism is a theology because it elevates the market to divine status. No amount of human suffering or destruction of the biosphere can prove it false because its truths are considered eternal and not subject to contradictory evidence. We are told there is no alternative. Now, neoliberal economic theory shapes government policies. For example, taxation policies that allow the wealthy to park their money in tax havens and avoid paying taxes in the country where their wealth was earned. It affects social and environmental protection programs. It's also reflected in trade agreements, which are negotiated in secret and give corporations unrestricted rights. For example, many people don't realize how serious this is. For example, rights that trump government laws to protect human health. and rights that can challenge and block government efforts to establish clean energy programs. As a result, free trade agreements have led to the impoverishment of many, a shrinking middle class, the vast enrichment of a tiny percentage of people, and the devastation of the earth and its climate. David MacDonald, in reviewing Naomi Klein's recent book in the United Church Observer, points out that, quote, "The same economic system that can't put the brakes on fossil fuel use is also responsible for creating obscene concentrations of wealth among a global elite. And these elites have a stranglehold over our economy, our politics, and most of our media." We cannot continue on the path of ever-growing consumption and accumulation of wealth. In fact, we must change course fast if we are to avert climate chaos. What is needed is transformation. We can think of it in terms of the Great Turning, a term used by authors Joanna Macy and David Corton, which resonates with the words of the prophet Ezekiel when he called on the people of Israel to turn from your evil ways and live, and also with the psalmist's call to turn my heart to your decrees and not to selfish gain. The Great Turning is about a new reality breaking into an old one. It calls us to seek a socially just, ecologically sustainable, and spiritually fulfilling human presence on earth. Glimpses of this can be seen in the ongoing resilience and life-renewing capacity of nature itself, as well as in the millions of movements of people struggling to recreate a world where all have enough and where all can live well in harmony with the greater community of life. How do we go about this? Well, first, we must change our way of thinking about ourselves in relation to the earth. For too long, we have thought of ourselves as outside the web of nature and able to manipulate it to our own ends. Indigenous peoples have a great deal to teach us about living in harmony with Mother Earth, taking only what we need, always conscious of the impact of our actions on 7 generations to come. This ancestral wisdom provides a vision of genuinely sustainable societies where people care for one another, engage in creative work, and deepen their spiritual lives while sharing in the Creator's gifts of clean air, water, and nutritious food. Indigenous wisdom also embodies the belief that the well-being of humankind depends on the well-being of the whole creation, and thus we're all interdependent. And I echo the prayer that was said earlier. First Nations Chief Seattle expressed this well when he said, "All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. We didn't weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves." The second and equally important task that we must undertake is to actively seek justice. Now, down through the ages, Christians have responded compassionately to poverty and human need with acts of charity. Indeed, if we're truly grateful for what we have, we can do no less. Charity born of compassion and kindness is vital. But it doesn't address the question of why there is growing inequality in our world, with 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, or what to do about the greatest threat that humankind has ever faced, climate change. To address these broader issues, we need to engage in the social form of compassion, which is justice. To seek justice means working through the democratic process to change government thinking and help to shape new systems, new policies, and new ways of thinking. And this means being political. But some people will say we shouldn't mix religion with politics. Archbishop Desmond Tutu responds by saying, "I'm puzzled about which Bible people are reading when they say religion and politics don't mix." In fact, the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, and Amos, not only railed against the injustice of the times, but they insisted that for worship to be acceptable in God's eyes, it must be accompanied by action for justice. In fact, there was an ancient prophetic tradition in which God insisted not merely on justice and worship, but on justice over worship. God repeatedly said, "I reject your worship because of your lack of justice." But never ever did God say, "I reject your justice because of your lack of worship." Consider this passage from Amos, who was clear that God had said, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The Old Testament imperatives for justice are clear. But in the New Testament, the mandate for seeking justice is even stronger. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus announced his ministry by reading from the prophecy of Isaiah, saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then, rolling up the scroll, Jesus sat down. With the eyes of everyone in the synagogue on him, he said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Good news to the poor, freedom for prisoners, release of the oppressed, the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus was announcing an era of jubilee, in which the distortions and inequities that had crept into society were to be eliminated and God's economy of enough for all reestablished. But he was saying much more than that when he announced, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." With these words, Jesus proclaims that he is ushering in the beginning of God's kingdom here on earth, a kingdom characterized by peace and justice, where there is enough for all. How did Jesus go about this? We know he associated mostly with the poor and performed many acts of healing born of compassion for the sick and grieving. But he also challenged rules and customs that emphasized ritual purity over compassion and human well-being. He challenged the patriarchy that denied women their right to participate meaningfully in society. He challenged Jewish discrimination against Gentiles by teaching that Jews and Gentiles were equal in God's love. And most importantly, Jesus challenged and resisted the violent domination system of the Roman Empire, in which the Jewish king and the chief priests and scribes and elders of the temple in Jerusalem were active participants. A word of explanation from Marcus Borg last week. This is one of 2 copies which you have in your church library. I really recommend it. In Jesus' time, the Jewish king and the chief priests of the temple were appointed by the Roman governor. The temple was responsible for collecting the annual taxes that were due to imperial Rome, as well as an array of local taxes. One of the perks of tax collecting was to collect more than was necessary and to confiscate the land of people who had fallen into debt and couldn't pay. Well, the temple authorities were thus amassing great wealth by exploiting the poor. But in return for being given license to indulge their greed, Rome charged them with the responsibility of keeping the Jewish people quiet and submissive. Anything that stirred up the people and threatened the peace was a threat to the system from which the Jewish authorities were benefiting. Growing numbers of people were flocking to hear Jesus, and they were delighted at his skill in avoiding the temple authorities' repeated efforts to entrap him, and his ability to use these opportunities to expose and challenge the complicity of the temple authorities in the oppressive domination system of the Roman Empire. So great was Jesus' popularity with the crowds that the authorities feared an uprising. Jesus' culminating act of nonviolent resistance to imperial Roman oppression and local Jewish collaboration took place on the Monday before his crucifixion. Entering the outer courtyard of the temple, Jesus drove out the buyers and sellers of animals, overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of the dove sellers, and said, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers"? According to theologians Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, Jesus meant that God's temple had been turned into a refuge or den for the high priests, scribes, and elders who were collaborating in Rome's violent and oppressive domination system, and using the Jewish religion to legitimize it. In so doing, they had turned the temple into a place where worship substituted for justice. Jesus was prepared to accept the consequences of his action, and for him, the consequences were crucifixion and death. Jesus did not seek suffering and death, but he accepted it as the inevitable consequence of living an all-encompassing love that challenged oppressive power systems and the injustice that resulted from them. We are called to follow Jesus in walking the path of radical love that challenges today's oppressive power systems and the injustice and environmental collapse that they are causing. As individuals and as communities, we engage in charitable action to alleviate human need, and we take steps to reduce our carbon footprint. But the sum of all these individual efforts will not be sufficient to lift the poor out of poverty or to create a realistic path back to a safe climate world unless there is concerted action by the world's governments and international bodies. And they're unlikely to act unless we, the citizens, become involved in the democratic process to persuade them to act. For Canadians, seeking justice in the face of this human tragedy is to work through the democratic process to persuade the Canadian government to reduce military spending, increase spending on social and environmental protection programs, honor human and environmental interests, to take action on reducing Canada's carbon emissions, and especially to work for a strong international treaty on climate change that would avert catastrophic, unstoppable climate change and promote a safe climate world for our children and grandchildren. Working for social justice and climate justice is at the core of who we are as Christians. It is challenging work, but it's essential if we are to ensure that the earth can sustain humankind and provide enough for all, both now and for generations to come. But we're not alone. We are part of a community of people, accompanied by God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. The prophet Micah gives us a vision of the goal we strive for. He said, "They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken." Usually that quotation ends with converting the swords into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks, and nation won't take up sword against nation, etc. But they omit the second part, which is equally important. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. Micah is saying that peace is not just the absence of war. It's not just a matter of converting the weapons of war to farming implements. No. Micah also speaks of vines and fig trees, a world of abundance where justice prevails. Everyone has enough, and no one need to worry about where their next meal is coming from or whether they can find affordable housing. Micah is speaking in prophetic witness to a vision of the kingdom of God, where God's economy of enough for all has been reestablished, and there is justice and peace. Jesus, through his passionate, nonviolent challenge to the violent and unjust domination system of his time, began the process of establishing the kingdom or reign of God on earth. And I believe that God is calling us to take action to help bring it to completion. How do we go about doing this? Well, whenever and wherever people enter into compassionate and just relationships with one another, the kingdom of God is being realized. Whenever we take steps to reduce our carbon footprint, the kingdom of God is being realized. Whenever we engage in advocacy with government representatives to dismantle unjust systems and beliefs and replace them with others that promote social and economic justice, we're giving prophetic witness to the kingdom of God. And when we advocate with government representatives and political candidates for immediate strong action on climate change, we are engaging in prophetic witness to the kingdom of God. Sometimes the kingdom wanes or even disappears. For example, when we treat others with disrespect or intolerance, when human rights are violated, when we are silent in the face of the poverty and misery that afflicts so much of our world, when we allow unfettered capitalism and greed to wreak destruction of the biosphere, when we continue to tolerate stockpiles of 16,000 nuclear weapons in the world and the risk that they pose to humankind and the earth. Conversely, our actions towards social justice, economic justice, and climate justice are like seeds that we sow, like the tiny mustard seed that grows and becomes the largest plant in the garden, like the yeast that swells the dough and produces a loaf. Small acts that are cumulatively capable of yielding substantial results. Actions such as signing an online petition or writing a letter to the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister urging that Canada take action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and work with other nations at the UN talks in Paris later this year to conclude a strong climate treaty that will help avert catastrophic, unstoppable climate change. Year after year, the international community has postponed agreement on a climate treaty. At last year's climate talks in Peru, no progress was made either on setting targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or on compensating the poorest populations in the world for loss and damage suffered due to more violent storms and rising seas. Mariana Parvin, an indigenous woman from Bangladesh, told the final plenary session, "It pains me that when I go back, I will tell my people that wealthy governments just talked about which lands will be lost, which communities displaced, which cultures destroyed, and which lives are less important." This year, 2015, governments have said that they intend to sign a climate treaty. I believe that we must do all we can to ensure that they do not fail. In the end, it's a matter of life or death for future generations and the planet itself. As William Hague, Britain's Secretary of State and former leader of the British Conservative Party, put it, you cannot have food security, water security, or energy security without climate security. And with that, I will end.
Thank you. You open for
Questions? Sure.
Sure. I have a microphone here if anybody needs the microphone. Anybody has any questions?
And I'm just curious about your background and when you really sort of got on fire and started working so hard. Were you quite a young person? I mean, was this an awareness of yours before climate change actually?
Oh, yes. Well, I started my activism in the early 1980s. You remember President Reagan was in office at the time, and he was telling us that we could fight and win a nuclear war without damage to the homelands. I mean, really, seriously. There was a book written by a journalist, Robert Scheer, called With Enough Shovels, and he spent a whole night, apparently, interviewing the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the United States, who told him that if everyone had a shovel and could dig a hole and have a door on top of it and 3 feet of dirt on top of that, that we could survive a nuclear war. He was Assistant Defense Secretary, can you believe it? So a lot of people got active in those days. Those were the days of the Greenham Common, where the women were protesting the cruise missiles in England, and we in Canada were protesting the testing of the cruise missile over the Canadian North. So I got involved that way, and then of course one thing led to the other, and I realized that you can't have peace without social justice as well. And so I was lucky to attend a number of church-sponsored conferences right on these particular subjects. There was a lot of activity around Jubilee. From 1998 to 2000, there was an effort to try and get people to lobby for the cancellation of the debts of the poor countries of the world, because these poor people were struggling under debt and couldn't possibly pay it back, and their people were just suffering. Also, I was part of a group that attended a session that was sponsored by the Ecumenical Coalition on Economic Justice. I think it's been rolled into to Kairos now. It's part of that coalition. But it was on building a moral economy. And I learned so much from that. About neoliberalism, for example, what it is, what the doctrines are, how debt is considered sin, for which a country has to be punished by structural adjustment measures that cut social programs and environmental protection, etc., etc. And I also wanted to challenge, I felt that the mandate for social justice and for this kind of work was so evident in scriptures. And I was so excited to find this book by Mark Sporg and John Crossan the last week. It's on Mark's gospel account of the last week in Jesus' life, because he brings out all this good stuff about, Jesus' challenge to the Roman domination system of the time and the collaboration of Jewish authorities in it. So that's basically how I came to where I am now. But I feel I have felt a call to engage in this work for quite some time now.
And I have an uncle who is was a top executive in an oil industry corporation, and he had an epiphany, and he had to leave that position, and he has dedicated his life till now to he focuses on the peak oil situation and the recognition that in North American society, we're the ones that are going to struggle the most, because we won't have the capacity to survive without all of the benefits of hydro and oil and so on. If indeed it runs out and we are not prepared. Mm-hmm. And so he established, I'm getting to the question, in Peterborough, he was big in establishing the transition town. And I just wondered if you've heard of that, and if people you are associated with here have ever thought of pursuing that kind of direction, so that people in the community could become involved in a way that.
Well, there's an organization here called the CASA, Community Citizens for, what is it called? CASS, for a strong, sustainable salmon arm, and that's been one of their, part of their work is to promote this transition, Townsend transition program.
Good.
But not many people know about it, and it's not being actively promoted now.
Well, it's a little bigger in some parts of the country, and of course in Europe, there are many transition towns. In Peterborough, it's well established. They've come out with their own coin system for the downtown businesses, their own currency, and they've changed all kinds of local bylaws, so many people can have hen houses, chickens in their backyards, and all ways to sustain themselves without having to rely on the grocery store. So it's just a fascinating, I just wondered if you knew about it.
But if the government used this low dropping oil price as an opportunity to get into renewable energy,
yes,
and even the oil companies, if they switch to getting renewable energy, we could create many more jobs that are being lost in the oil patch. I've got a letter coming to, going to the Premier of Alberta, reminding him I lived there for 33 years, and I really think that with all the wind in southern Alberta, they ought to be capitalizing more on that.
And they're not talking about the politicians.
Oh, well, there's that too.
I have two things that are sort of related that I want to say. One is, how do we get your message? All the people here probably already feel strongly the way you do, and I always think that the reason things don't get changed is because of education. If people knew what you knew, of course they would do something different. They would have to. And so how do you get this message out to the people that aren't interested in coming here? That's my one part. The other part is, there was a politician not that long ago that out loud said, I don't know that climate change really exists, or that there's a climate problem. Like, if you've got people in power that refuse to see that, that there is even an issue, how can you get them to change how things are being done?
Well,
They're sort of related.
To answer the first part of your question, well, Kairos has been holding programs for a number of years, and people who are not necessarily involved in churches come to those programs.
Right, and I'm not saying church people, I'm saying people that are interested in, the environment and what you do.
Yeah.
But how do we get it out to other people that...
Well, by word of mouth, by talking with your neighbors and friends and your relatives and associates. It really is real missionary work, You've got to engage in talking with people. But on especially on climate change, I'm about to put a promo for our program on Earth Day, April 22nd. We're holding a program here in the hall at 7 p.m. on our planet and climate change. What can we do? Is the second part of the title. And we're going to start with 4 short but very powerful films explaining why we have to turn around, why we have to address climate change, and what we have to do.
Politicians to come to that.
Oh, we will.
Like, that would be the thing if we could force the people
Well,
that have the power.
Yeah, we'll certainly invite them.
Yeah.
And Kairos, our committee, has been talking to the various candidates, political candidates. As far as, sometimes though, it's been said that it's kind of useless to try and persuade a climate change denier, that it's probably a waste of time. But you can always find climate change deniers, well, I think a lot of them have links to the oil and gas industry, for one thing. But there's a long version of an excellent film called Arctic Death Spiral and the Methane Time Bomb, which starts off with, shows some of these climate change deniers in the States, the southern states especially, saying that no, it doesn't exist, it's just part of the natural variations in temperature. It's not true. And then there's also a film called Thin Ice, which, if you want to find out about the science that investigates climate change and compares how much our climate is warming, and that it analyzes ice, which contains oxygen or whatever, that shows what the Earth was like thousands and thousands of years ago compared to now.
Do you think that the politicians that were naysayers before are coming around now? Do you think that they're starting? Because I always heard that for all evidence one way, you can find people that are so-called experts that say the opposite. Do you think that the politicians are starting to believe?
I don't. Do you think so? What do other people think? Do you hear any signs of change of thinking?
I think maybe the winter they had in eastern Canada and the United States this year might make some people think it's a few second thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was,
Yeah.
it still is.
Right.
There's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
There's something wrong, there has to be.
The oil companies have very deep pockets. And one author said not too long ago, there's no one harder to convince than somebody who is paid to believe something.
Yes.
And
It may
in
be,
a way it's part of a much deeper phenomenon, and that education has got so bad in the States that there is a huge proportion of the population that doesn't trust scientists and doesn't trust science. It's too hard for me to understand, so it can't be true.
Bad science. Yeah.
I'm not saying can any of it is any better. We don't have figures.
Yes.
I was going to say two things. One is that, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of small things to help change the climate. And I think we have to have confidence in those people and encourage them. I was at a conference in Kamloops. It was Master Gardener Conference, but the city of Kamloops was there, and they had a speaker who was explaining to us how we could be food sustainable in the area of Kamloops. So what they've done, because they said, suppose there was a disaster and there was no way, the highways would be closed on the other side of Kamloops and of course over here, and there would be no access. And there's like 1,000 trucks going through this city every day. So if that was not happening and we were landlocked, how would we survive? Where's the food going to come from? So the city of Kamloops has mapped all the farms, those that are sitting in agricultural reserves not being used, those that are being used. Then they've gone to cultural farms, that is economically producing farms, that are like truck gardens, organic farms. And then thirdly, they went to backyards. And because there's a lot of stuff happening, like chickens and so forth in backyards. And they were amazed at how much food is being produced and how conscious people are of where the food is and what could happen if stuff wasn't coming from California. So I think we have to, and I know there's a movement starting now in this town, but I was trying to map the same kind of thing. So, we can read Naomi Klein and wish we had Elizabeth May in our riding and all this kind of stuff. But the other thing I was going to say is that it's really important, like we did this in Vancouver the last time there was a federal election. Our United Church sent people to the all candidates meeting and they had questions to ask. So when it came time for open questions, they stood up and they had a question about climate change, they had a question about homelessness. So they had to think and give us an answer that was representative of their party. So I think there's pressure we can put on, like go to these meetings and hear what the various parties have to say. So there's lots of stuff happening in the local level. Be aware of it, support it, broaden it if you can, but also get to those candidates meetings and ask a few questions.
Exactly, yeah. And I've just been in touch with Kairos's John Dillon, who's the ecological program director, and he says one of the most important things we can do is to find out what views and policies of our candidates are and vote for someone who's going to support strong action on climate change. It's really a civic duty. We have a civic duty to, as responsible.
I wish it was compulsory.
Pardon?
I wish it was compulsory,
Yeah.
like it is in some countries.
Yes, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about activism compared to the 80s, 70s. It's so different now. I think people get awareness, they sign a petition online, lots more come, and you can read more and see if it, makes you interested in becoming more active. But what do you think about that?
Oh, well, when I think of the work when I was in Lethbridge and working to promote awareness about programs, to publicize them, and I'd go around with my little notices to every church, and it was such a lot of work. And now I just send everything out by email. It's so much easier, and it's so much easier to stay in touch with people and to get information. That's what I can just go Google for, what I'm looking for, and up it pops.
So the passion is still there for
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Maybe even more so because there's so many
Oh,
more
I think so. I think so. And I think,
contacted and connected.
and young people are becoming more engaged too. And I think that's really, really important. But on what we can do to promote awareness in other people who are not church people, well, writing letters to the editor is really, really important. I think that can make quite a difference.
In late 90s, there was a group of clergy, and we were all in Saskatoon at the time, and that was around the time where we had to have police records checks. And we were all in a gathering one evening and comparing the fact that we'd all passed. Like, we all got through with our police record check intact. And then we started talking about the fact that we probably shouldn't. There should be public disobedience amongst all the clergy. If we're really following Jesus's way, there should be public disobedience. We should be protesting and arrested for it. I mean, not that that would show up as a major concern on your police records check, but it really opened up a lot of interesting conversation amongst the clergy. And always we reach the point where we're all accountable to a congregation who has a mission that doesn't fit what we're necessarily believing, right? So our ability to go beyond what we really believe is often constrained to a point by the congregation's mission.
When you say to what we believe, do you mean what we believe about the Christian message, or
What we believe about what action ought to be happening from the Christian message? What ways we should be treating each other, the ways in which we should be concerned about the environment, or any of the other issues as you so well spoke about in your talk. It's not always easy. So that's when I was thinking, even with politicians, we really need to do the grounds, like from the ground up. People need to start to say, this is the way the world needs to be, and build it around them in their own communities. And then start letting the politicians know that here's who we are, and if you want to represent us, you need to represent what we believe. Yeah.
But I think that the church has kind of missed a lot of the social message of the gospel. I got this little bit from the website of Marcus Borg, who, by the way, died just in January. Jesus was not a secular social revolutionary, he was God's revolutionary. And God's passion, what God is passionate about, according to Jesus, is for an earth in which swords are beaten into plowshares, in which every family shall live under their own vine and fig tree, not just subsistence, but more than subsistence. This was the passion of Jesus, and for Christians, Jesus is the revelation of God's passion.